Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Yul Gordon. Welcome back to Performance Talk. My partner today, as always, and we're more than happy to see him, Chris Costa. Chris, how are you doing, man?
I am well. How are you?
I have no complaints. I was just telling our guests, which you're going to introduce here in a second, about my grass cutting technique. Jump on the lawnmower and turn it on and ride. Just don't worry about where you are.
At least you don't have a push mower.
I do have one of those too that I have to use, and a weed eater and chainsaw yesterday.
And that's fun.
But that's not why we're here, ladies and gentlemen. Like I said, Chris is back. We're happy to have him. Always happy to hear from him or see him. Chris, why don't you introduce our guest today, man?
Yes, so today our guest is Ryan Comeau. Ryan is, I would say, the leader of Kinetisense, and we'll let Ryan kind of tell you a little bit more about what Kinetisense is from a company standpoint, a product line standpoint. We had the pleasure of talking to Ryan yesterday a little bit about the company, and I think you'll be excited to hear kind of what these guys do, how they're different from what else is out there, and what they have going on in the future.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, guys. Yeah, and you know what? Just to it's funny we're talking about that lawn mowing, the lawn mowing that's involved, Joel, and you have an acreage. And I was saying how one of my buddies recently moved to an acreage and how you guys need to start a support group. So if any of the listeners on the podcast have recently moved out to an acreage and you realize you have to sit on a lawnmower for like 7 hours a day, you need to reach out and join the support group. The Yule's going to be starting up here. You'll send the information out on that.
Yeah, he's volunteering me for that. Yeah, thanks a lot. Now we'll get all kind of email. Hey, just listen to the podcast, man.
Right.
So tell us, introduce yourself. I know we've already introduced you, but introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us what you're doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. We're really excited to be here. I'll tell a little bit about my story, I guess the background of why we started Kinetisense and a little bit about, our journey. For me, I played NCAA Division I hockey, and I grew up in a medical family, and so I thought at the time I wanted to get into medicine, and then because I grew up in that, but also I loved sports and I loved hockey. I'm a Canadian, so that's what we do in Canada is we play hockey, and fast forward to in my studies and playing Division I hockey, I was constantly getting injured my first year. It started out as a right knee injury. Took me 4 months to rehab and go through that process. And then right hip injury was another 3-4 months. And what I was realizing was that I was seeing all these different types of practitioners and trainers, all these different people involved in the rehab, but also working on, my movement. And everyone took a different perspective and approach on my injury and my rehab. And it was very joint specific. Meaning that if my knee had the injury at the time, everyone was concentrating on my knee.
Right.
And it wasn't until I went to this chiropractor that that was somewhat affiliated with our university that he's like, you know what, man? He's like, your problems, your constant injuries on this right side, this is a biomechanical chain problem. You have a whole problem with how you move. There's a reason why it's the right knee, the right ankle, the right hip. You have a serious planar deficiency on that side of your body that is not only impeding your performance, but is actually causing you to have really high risk of injury. And it honestly hit me. I'm like, you know what? This is what sports medicine is about. It's about that marriage of that functional approach and that performance side that then leads to increased performance and injury reduction,
right?
Which is amazing because that's what, our athletic trainers, our coaches are all part of that ecosystem. So that's what got me into chiropractic. And long story short, I worked in a biomechanics lab a little bit as an undergrad in these $1 million Vicon lab. You put the black suit on and you can analyze biomechanics, and it's really, really cool. You probably see it on the EA Sports commercials. They put these on the players. And then fast forward to chiropractic school, I'm like, anyone that is involved in human movement, whether you're a practitioner, that's I should say a clinician, or whether you're a coach, a trainer, ATC, you name it, we have very limited tools to look at kinematic sequencing of the entire body. And so we wanted to put, a Vicon-like a tool in the hands of the everyday coach, the everyday practitioner, and create this ecosystem that's data-driven, because I think that that's the biggest mistake. So we started with the Xbox camera. We've now progressed all the way where we can get 3D biomechanical data with an iPad Pro, with the LiDAR sensor that's in the device of the iPad Pro, and be able to actually, after a functional movement screen is done that takes 56 seconds to do, map out the joints on the body that need mobility and stability and tell you what planes of deficit they are. So we're getting into that granular approach of the N=1 of the athlete, or the N=1 of the patient.
So
and that's what we do.
Sorry to jump
in a nutshell.
Talk a little bit about, strength coaches aren't the biggest budget people out there. So talk a little bit about why we have to use the iPad Pro as opposed to the regular iPad. I mean, everybody can go out and spend, we'll say $2,000-3,000 on several iPads, so they can have them all throughout their facility or multiple facilities, or each coach can have one. Right. In this case, it's not applicable. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when we're looking at human movement, we were talking about 3 planes of movement. So triplanar is that term where it's the frontal plane, the sagittal plane from the side, and then the transverse plane from that overhead. And what we're finding is that in human performance and human movement, the plane where we see the most compensation is that overhead view, that transverse plane. And so we have to, in order for us to be able to get that overhead view, we have to have a device that gives us depth perception and allows us to figure out rotation of the body from that overhead view. And the LiDAR sensor is a depth camera, and those are only available in the iPad Pro. You can't just use a regular iPad. If we go to 2D assessment, which there are a lot of products out there that are two-dimensional, on the everyday non-LiDAR iPhone or non-LiDAR iPad, we're really only getting one dimension of movement at any given point, depending on how that athlete's standing. We definitely cannot get transverse plane, that overhead view. So getting those 3 planes at the same time requires a LiDAR camera, and in my opinion, gives us 100% of the biomechanics. 2D really only gives us 33% of the biomechanical data. So we're missing that transverse plane. That's the key.
So from a when you're looking at it from a budget standpoint, one iPad Pro saves you time versus 6 just using an iPad and only getting 2 planes of motion, or 1 plane of motion. Even though it may seem like, okay, we can buy 4 of these, so why not find something that allows us to buy 4 pads as opposed to 4. It's an economic thing.
Well, it's about quality. I mean, as Ryan said, you're not going to get the quality of assessment with a camera that is less sophisticated. So you need a more sophisticated camera to be able to acquire the information that the camera is capable of acquiring. And the newer products and the more expensive products, unfortunately, are the only ones that have the scanner built into them. And maybe that'll change. So, for you strength coaches out there, like, an iPad Pro, just get one. Just get one and use that, and then use your other iPads.
And even get some of these, like the 2022 is really when that LiDAR started to show up in the iPad Pro. You can get a used iPad Pro, that's 2-3 years old, and it doesn't have to be brand new.
Yeah, they're pretty reasonably priced at that point, about half.
Yep, exactly.
And tell our audience why being able to collect data from movement is important. I mean, we all like to do it, but not everybody understands the complete importance of being able to track baseline movement to movement over a period of time, et cetera, and how that helps, with development of training programs and so forth and so on.
Are you sure about that, Euro? Because there's a lot of practitioners out there I feel like are just totally afraid of tracking movement. They don't think it adds any value to their programming. They don't think that it has any purpose in changing philosophical approaches to things.
How did that question come across?
I'm just saying, you mentioned that practitioners, and I'm using the term practitioners, but people
Right.
that are in the field of strength and conditioning, athletic training, physical therapy, they want to be able to track how people move. And I don't disagree with you, but I think there's a lot, maybe Ryan can kind of elucidate this a little bit more. I think there's a lot that really don't care. They don't think it's important.
Well,
At least I've come across many that are like, yeah, we don't need that. No, we don't need that. Yeah, we don't have time to do that.
Well, I think I want to know the why of all that. I think we're asking the same question or around the same bush, but yes, I why don't they want to, etc. I think that's part of the whole question I was trying to get out.
It's a phenomenal question, and I have a take on this, and it might be a long-winded one, but if you think about how we've become limited by our methods for so long, keep in mind that this technology of being able to get 3 planes of motion, a functional movement screen in 56 seconds that maps is very, very novel. We didn't necessarily have this 5-10 years ago. So I think a lot of the misconceptions about the need to do functional movement screening and map the global perspective of the body is actually due to the fact that this wasn't a possibility. And people are still learning that this is actually a new paradigm, and that shift is still happening. I equate this to it's called the functional continuum model. This is a whole perspective of looking at the realm of human performance. And if you imagine that on one continuum, so imagine one line, on the one end, let's say the left side of that is maximal human performance of that individual. On the other end of that line is risk of injury and the injury side. And I believe the best NMSK providers, and I've seen this because I've met some of the top around the world, these guys that work with Manchester United, Tottenham Hotspur, the trainers that are working with elite athletes. The best in the world are able to figure out very accurately where on that continuum that athlete is at any given point, any given day. So we're talking about a science-based approach where I need to know N equals 1. I need to know where that person is on that continuum. I also need to know over time, are they shifting towards better performance and away from risk of injury and compensation?
Right.
Or are they actually shifting towards risk of injury and compensation away from performance? That's
the key point, right, Ryan? More than anything is the differentiation from day to day, even with what we would call, you will notice I hate the word elite athletes.
Yeah.
Fatigue plays a major role, okay, on performance, not only physiological, but psychological performance too. So if an individual is overly fatigued, that is going to affect even the most elite. So if we're not looking at it on, as you mentioned, a day-to-day basis or even an intraday basis.
Right.
If and we really want to get in the weeds.
It has to be objective. It has to be scored. You have to have a change of score based on amount of compensation. It can't be all or nothing like some of the functional movement screens that are out there that are visual are and subjective. You have to have trend data to look at change over time. That is absolutely critical. Yes. The other thing is that our functional movement screen, we're looking at the slightest adjustments and compensations of what's the kinematic sequencing that the person goes through to accommodate a certain movement, whether it's a squat or an inline lunge. We're actually assessing the subconscious movement patterns of that athlete. So you talk about, imagine how advanced that trainer or coach is when they're now able to actually assess subconscious neurological movement patterns. And that's what the system allows to do in a very easy way and easy to apply. That's really what sports performance is. When we're on the field, we're not thinking about every single muscle we fire when we're going to catch that pass. It's all subconscious. We just want to let our reflexes and our training take over. And that's the subconscious brain. We analyze that with Kinetisense, and that's the real cool part. So I would argue that those that feel that they don't need to assess movement and functional movement, that we know transitions over to sports performance, they're taking a very theoretical approach to their training interventions, with all due respect. The ones that are now the high-end trainers, the ones that are now bringing in Kinetisense as a tool in their toolbox, I would argue that they're becoming movement scientists. And I think that every single trainer, coach, practitioner that adds tools like Kinetisense, we shouldn't be the only tool. You should have a toolbox of different tools. I think when you're using data to track and to become granular in your approach, you now become a movement scientist, which is pretty darn cool. That's where the space is.
I think one of the most important pieces that this brings is the trend data, the over time data, because we all know that during a career, movement changes during a season, even from the beginning of the season to the end of the season, movement changes. So if you're able to track that, there's things that are possible in adjustments to training programs, how we practice, et cetera, that you can do to ensure that we stay on the performance end of the movement continuum as opposed to moving towards the injury end or the risk end. What is kind of the biggest thing, if you had to take one thing that Kinetisense does that is most valuable, what would you tell somebody looking at the system it was?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I truly think that it's we call it the functional planar mapping, the ability to take these compensations and map it on an avatar to show you right away where are the areas of stability and mobility deficits, but then also the scoring. And the scoring is not just quantitative, it's qualitative. That's the difference between us and the visual-based screens. We can look at trend data, and you made a really good point. I'll give you an example of how this has been used. There's a professional baseball team that used Kinetisense. They won the World Series the year that they implemented Kinetisense. And they were screening all of their MLB players every single week because it was so fast to do. Where normally with their other screenings, it took them 20, 30 minutes to do each player. They would only do beginning of season and end of season. So, and it was subjectively scored. So now they had, because it was so fast, they could screen every week and collect, it's called trend data, right? Because it's data driven from the system. We can compare over time. And one of the things that they noticed was that the majority of their non-contact injuries were happening in the last quarter of the season and in the playoffs. And we're talking about a player sprinting to first base and pulling a hamstring. We're talking about Achilles tendon ruptures. We're talking about muscles tears in the rotator cuff. Different things like that. And how devastating is that to an athlete, but to the team in general, when your players are going down with non-contact injuries and it's like getting ready for playoff time? Like, that is go time. And when they looked at the trend data of the players over time, they noticed that in near the last quarter of the season, that some of those players were tailing off in their functional movement scoring on Kinetisense, on our functional movement screen called CAMS. They were all like 87s, 86s, 90s, 92s, and then boom, they were starting to drop into the 70s. And these players had a history of non-contact injuries in the last quarter of the season previous. So they actually use this data on their players to say, there's functional fatigue happening here in some of these players. We need to look at their sleep. We got to look at our travel scheduling. We got to look at our training. And what they found is when they started to back off and do and change training protocol and get specific to training the plane that player needed to train so that they're balanced in all planes, that's when they started to see less functional fatigue. They had a healthier roster going into playoffs. And lo and behold, I'm not saying that Kinetisense is why they won the World Series at all, but I'm saying that we were one of the tools with the other tools that they were using that may have helped to keep some of their players healthier going into playoffs. And amazingly, they won the World Series, which is a really cool story. But functional fatigue, man, what a cool concept. Where as a trainer, we can do this with our athletes, we can do this with every level of athlete. We can actually adjust training protocol, be specific to training the specific plane of movement deficit. And Chris, we actually, remember yesterday I mentioned, I think that's one of the biggest problems with early specialization.
Yeah.
But these athletes, why are these young athletes with early specialization? I think that they become planar dominant. I think that they become imbalanced in the different planes of movement. And so to answer your question again, I think that that's really what the value is figure that out really quick, get an overall score, track that over time, look at which planes they have deficits in, apply that into your training, right? And then track over time. And then if an injury occurs, lo and behold, we now have a baseline to then build them back up to again. That's
a lot
another
of our sports have really, really ugly movement patterns just built into them. Think about the positioning of a catcher. Just an ugly movement pattern. Golfers, ugly movement pattern. I mean, it can be done very beautifully. No, don't get me wrong.
Yep.
But there's so much variability in how they can move to move successfully, right? How they set up, how they hold that position. But it's so repeated, it's going to create that dominant type that you're talking about, that dominant movement pattern, that dominant plane adjustment pattern that, you have to do. I think that's the biggest problem is what we are learning is, look, we can't really change this, right? If we try to change the way they move biomechanically, we might cause an injury, we might reduce performance, and we might make that person a totally different player. Sometimes those super compensations that our elite athletes have are optimized for their sport and their person, who they are as an athlete. So it makes it very difficult to understand if we're not looking at how they move in the first place. And our eyes can be great. 20, 30, 40 years of experience, it's great, right? You have all this information in your brain and you can see and assess, but you can't assess something like a camera does. You can't assess something like slow motion video capture does because you can't see it in that capacity. You can't review it even more. You can review what you think you saw in your brain. So we were all sitting in a room, right? And we were analyzing someone's movement. We would probably all see a few different things. We'd probably all see some similarities. We might describe things a bit differently. So I think that products like yours, like Kinetisense and the others out there, can help us to create symbiosis even across our communication patterns.
100%. It's a really important term. There's a lot of AI technology stuff that is coming out and almost I want to say bombarding the NMSK space. And a lot of trainers and coaches and practitioners are fearful of this. And the really important thing is that Kinetisense, we're expert augmentation, and we're another tool in your toolbox of other tools to allow you to quickly be able to get a feel as to where that athlete stands at any given time to then enhance your abilities to quickly activate a program or training that's going to enhance. That's a really important concept. Back to your comment about functional movement patterning with certain athletes and asymmetries are built in. That is very, very true. And that's why when we're doing the analysis with Kinetisense, with CAMs, we're looking at planar deficit. Because what we did find is even in the back catchers, the MLB catchers compared to even the AAA and AA catchers were more planar balanced, even though they may have had, less external rotation of the left shoulder compared to the right. Pitchers are classic for this. They're very right. Like overhead, quarterbacks, right? We don't want to necessarily, start mucking around from a joint by joint perspective too much with changing their biomechanics. But we do need to get them planar, from a planar deficit mode balanced. Transverse plane balanced with sagittal plane balanced with frontal plane, right? So if we can balance there without mucking around too much with the biomechanics of that individual, and that's really the key, because this is where when we compensate too much and we actually have a joint that becomes that becomes inhibited, we have to steal from another plane. to do a certain movement. When we steal from another plane, that's when we start to put unnatural stresses on some of the structures of the neuromusculoskeletal system, and that's where it can lead us to reduced performance, but then of efficiency of movement, but then also risk of injury.
Or even so extreme muscle structure too.
Correct.
It isn't meant to handle that kind of load repeatedly.
Correct. Let's think about, the pitcher. We know that arm slotting has a huge effect on strain of the ulnar, that collateral ligament of the elbow, which can put at risk that pitcher, Tommy John surgeries and things like that. Now, I know they're doing some Tommy John surgeries almost preventatively for performance now, but think about how torque, and am I going to be torquing from my hips, my core to get that rotation and power, or if I start to get tight in the hip and I can't rotate around that hip, I'm going to have to come in from the shoulder and the elbow and maybe put undue stress on that arm, right? So little things like that, the system can give insights, and over the course of a year, there's variability even day to day on the NMSK system, right? I might one week be tighter in a certain muscle than another week because maybe I was sitting more that week, right? So there's also, when you're thinking about training the everyday athlete or the young athlete that maybe spends 8 hours sitting in a chair in class all day. These are some of the things that we want to also tie in assessing ADLs, activities of daily life. And that's why getting screening, not just beginning of season and end of season is, but even weekly. But the only way to do that is you have to have something that's efficient. It has to be, give you that trend data immediately and allow you to implement into your programming immediately as well too. That's the key. We haven't had that until now. I think that's been the biggest shortcoming.
Yeah, and to your point made a little while back, we don't just change these mechanical patterns in the weight room. The weight room can have an effect on strength across multiplanar movements, right? How we actuate tissue across those multiplanar movements, especially when they're dynamic, which most obviously are. We use the gym as a fulcrum to help massage the athlete into a pattern that is ideal, or even strengthen the pattern that they currently use. Right. We also have to use that approach on the field, in practice, on the ice, on the courts, to help really drive that patterning in to that subconscious, as you were talking about, so that it's not just okay, we're training for this because we see this deficiency or deficit or this asymmetry. We're training to affect the asymmetry, to make it a bit more symmetrical if necessary. Then we have to train the patterning, the movement itself, in competition or through practice, theoretically, to try to then really fine tune that process, to really get it in line. I don't know how you can do that even as the quote unquote best movement scientist in the world, just visually. I don't know how you can get there without collecting data and analyzing that data. Joint angle change, right? Range of motion, all of these things are so terribly important when it comes to figuring out, what did they start with, right? Did they have 30 degrees of free range of motion, or did they not? Did they only have 15 degrees? Well, why did they only have 15 degrees? What caused
here? And this is a really important concept because, imagine that we could actually look at normative pattern sequencing of athletes in different positions and figure out what the best of the best are doing that are not getting injured, and how they're sequencing. But not only that, but based on body type, based on femoral length, based on torso length, with different body types. It's funny. Someone asked me the other day, talk about running, as an example. Like, what's the perfect running stride? We got the Olympics going on right now, and I don't know. I love I love the 100-meter, and it's like, okay, what is the best sprint? What is the best biomechanics? It's like, what? It every single body type has a different ideal, because there's different lever arms, there's different. So that's right. What we're doing with Kinetisense is we're looking at non-identifiable data of these different athletes at different body types, and we're going to be plugging that back into the system so that you can actually, analyze a professional catcher to a professional catcher, a population of professional catchers that are also right-handed, that also have the same body composition type as you. That, that's an example. And I think once we can start to do that, we're going to be able to answer that question, Chris.
So
right?
that really ties into what I was mentioning before. If we all sat down and we watched the 100-meter, right? If we watched it together, we would probably see very, very, very similar mechanical patterns across the field, right? We would have to slow it down and review it from all angles, from all planes of motion, to really be able to see that differentiation. Who has more internal rotation on the swing phase?
Right.
Who has less ankle extension, dorsiflexion, or more on contact, right? We're not going to see, I mean, maybe we could see a little bit of that live. It's going to be really hard for us to disseminate the difference. And then, as you were mentioning, well, does that difference actually apply to a performance enhancement for that athlete? Maybe for athlete A, it does. For athlete B, it doesn't. Because of those fulcrum differentiations, because of past injuries, right? Because of psychosocial things that I just don't like to move that way. It just doesn't feel comfortable to me, even though it produces more power, right?
There's a really important concept when we talk about asymmetries. With human movement, we always think about the joint by joint approach. We think about, we think that we can break down the movements of that sprinter by joint, and we can say, okay, what's their internal, external of the hip as they stand there, left versus right. You know what? The human motion does not work that way. It is neurological, and if we can give that athlete plasticity, we'll call it movement plasticity, that where they, although they may, be asymmetric in a certain patterning, but they have plasticity in their brain to be able to accommodate different planes when they need to activate that way, and they're not limited because of the lack of plasticity. That's really the key. And again, matching that to, of course, understanding the fulcrums and the lever lengths and different things like that of the body. I think it's going to be it's definitely a powerful thing. And you're right. We've taken such a theoretical approach where I almost call it cookie cutter. And it's not, not to disrespect our professions, but we're guessing a lot of the time. And a lot of times, we're training all of our hockey players the exact same way. We're training all football players the exact same way. Imagine that we could look at data and say, you know what, the O-line is actually showing these types of movement deficits compared to, the defensive line or the special teams or the quarterbacks, because those are sports within a sport, aren't they? Those different positions. And so that's what we need to do. And I think when we can start to get granular, what is that extra 2-3% that separates the greatest from the great, right? I think that we can get insights into that. It's not just that they're born with it, right?
Right.
There's of course, maybe they're born with better movement plasticity neurologically, right? But we can train stuff like this from, to a certain degree. We can maximize. It's like, okay, yeah, maybe there's a spectrum or a continuum of that specific athlete, but we're not even getting close to reaching their maximal performance capacities in a lot of ways. I think that this gives us insights to be able to get that extra 2%, 5%, 10% that becomes that differentiator for them.
This brings up a really good point where you and I have kind of talked about this quite a bit with other guests. How much change?
Right.
Too much change. How much pliability is too much pliability? Meaning pliability in what we are trying to do to elicit a change.
Yeah,
that's where we're get into the weeds and get into the mud. It's really hard to figure that out.
Yeah. Do I want to
move up to more elite athletes? The ramifications for doing so become much more potent.
Right. How much do I want to change and when? I think there's periods during an athlete's season and career where you can you can suggest some changes, and if the athlete is willing, then you can make some changes in movement and how they move that will help. And a tool like Kinetisense, you can go back and look at if you've used it for several years with that athlete, and you can show them where, okay, change is warranted now. Your performance either continued to progress the way you're moving to this point, but now it doesn't. So we think this is one of the reasons you're, planar deficient in this plane.
Yeah.
And while you haven't suffered from it performance wise, your body is now different, and you are now, different as an athlete. We might want to, at that point, start looking at, making some adjustments to how you move. We didn't say just a wholesale, like Chris was alluding to, we've talked about before. We're not going to take how you move and change it completely and make you something that you're not, but it's got to make sense, and it's got to have, it's got to have a progression that makes sense to the athlete.
I think to think that we can is a bit egotistical. I think there are a lot of
maybe we can
out there that think that they have the power to truly change someone. Look, at the end of the day, if the person doesn't want to do it, first and foremost, they're not going to put effort into it. It's going to elicit no response, or maybe even a negative response, right? So we have to include this psychosocial piece you've talked about. And I think we should revisit that. You've talked about the subconscious and how you tie into the subconscious with looking at your analysis through Kinetisense. And I think it's really key, and it's important for us to take this multifaceted approach to human performance. It isn't just about training. It isn't just about practice. It isn't just about performance in competition. It isn't just about sleep and hydration and nutrition. It isn't just about preparation, both mental and physical. It's everything brought together, right? And you talked about it a little earlier. Why not use the tools that are available to us? Is it fear? Is it fear of learning something new? Is it fear of phasing us out? Is it fear of ego loss? Is it resistance to anything new? So I guess that kind of ties into fear too. So we might have fear on both sides. We might have fear on the athlete side. Like, I don't know if I really want to do that. I've never done that before. I've had a trainer for 15 years and I'm here. I've gotten here. And that's the person that I've worked with, and they've never done that with me. So it's trust, right? It's both earning and regaining trust in certain situations. It's humility and being able to say, look, I don't, you know what? We're going to do this. It's not going to hurt you, but we're going to do this. And I'm not really sure what the result is going to be, but I want to see if we can elicit a response. And what is that response? We're going to look at the response, and we're going to make a determination from that point, whether it's effective or ineffective for you. And then we might do it with someone else too, to see if it's just a you thing or is it a population thing.
Right. Really, amazing points and a really important point that we shift into. And, it's about augmenting the process, not necessarily changing. I think that's one of the fears that some trainers have, especially if they've been working with professional athletes for quite some time, is they think that new insights like this might put performance at risk or their training at risk, where really, if they see it as an augmentative tool to their process and not, necessarily shutting down all the other, aspects of training they've been doing to that time, but augmenting it, I think that's really the key. We talk about the biopsychosocial side. I can tell you this, I can definitely tell you this, is that when you use a tool that augments your analysis and you can engage the athlete or the patient into that and say, hey, we just screened you, look at your mapping, it changes everything. Compliance goes usually through the roof, and that whole trust factor is developed at a much faster pace, because you're not simply relying on your opinion and expertise. You're engaging, you're bolstering your expertise and opinion with data-driven analytics. It's a game changer. It really is. So, and it is the paradigm shift. This is where the training world is going. We're seeing this already, that the top athletes are starting to gravitate to trainers and performance teams that have technologies like this.
Well, I think the athlete and the trainer or practitioner as well. I think it's all about value added. Right. You have to show the athlete that there's value added to what you're doing, and then for the practitioner, you have to believe that you're a value added proposition for the athlete or the team or the organization. Because if you say, oh well, we're gonna change how we evaluate movement, and this is what we're gonna do, and the first question is, well, how is that different than what we already do, or why do we need to do it? And you can't explain that value, then I think that's where a lot of practitioners run into trouble. And
it's not even about explaining. It's about being able to say, you know what, I don't know right now, but I have a hunch.
Or exactly.
That maybe there's something going on, and work with me on this. I think if we do this enough and we maybe tweak our programming a little bit, I can get you a little better performance. I can make you feel a little better when you're out there.
Hubris and humility.
Most of them are going to be like, all right, okay. If they trust you, right, they're going to be dialed in. And to Ryan's point, when they do it and it does potentially work, now they're yours for life. Now they trust you.
You say to them, hey, we're going to continue our programming, but we noticed on this system here that you're struggling in your transverse plane for stability. We're going to add some pal-off pressing to activate that transverse plane at the end of our session today. That simple change can it's not, we're not changing all of our programming and everything. We're doing an augmentative piece right at the end.
And that's what I mean by value added. Both of you guys, added to that. When I say explain, I don't necessarily mean that you're trying to convince them,
right? But
you tell them what you're doing. Say, hey, we're going to do this because, and if not for you, for me, so that I can help you.
Yeah, give them the why. You might need to convince. You might need to actually. They might be just very averse to change. A lot of athletes, especially as you get up in the higher realms,
and
they are very averse to change. They have this thing that they've done for so many years and it's worked. Why do I need to change it?
Because you were 19, 20, 21.
I can get you a little bit more. You're getting older. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. You were 19, 20, 21, and now you're 32.
Right.
And you want to play 3 more years.
Or do you want to play until you're 40? You're 19 now. If you don't change this, I've seen this in the past. I have data on it, right? I've worked with this team for 20 years. I have data on guys that were your age that are now towards the end of their career. This is where they end up if they don't.
Right.
Okay.
It comes down,
okay, coach, I got you.
It's evolution, man. And my question, have training practices and methods evolved? That's the question I have. Are we training athletes the same way that we did back in the early 1900s? We're not.
Yes and no. Yes and no.
Yes and no. Yeah, there's some fundamental things that we definitely still do.
Yep.
There's actually some things that we've gone away from that we go back to that we're way back then. But my point is there's always evolution. Mm-hmm. And I'm telling you, and all the listeners out there, the greatest you're going to see over the next 5 years, the greatest evolution in this space, it's going to happen very rapidly, is going to be data-driven training, analytics. It's already among us now.
I was going to say, I think we're at the front door and looking in already.
So if you have to get get on this train, or you get left behind somewhat because athletes are now requesting. It's becoming the new paradigm, right?
And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean,
no.
As a practitioner, you should be forced to be your best.
Yeah.
If you don't want to be your best
and evolve,
then you shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah.
If you feel like you're being forced to do something, it's probably time to step away, because anything that can make you better at what you do, you should be on board with it. You expect your athletes to put that trust in you, yet you can't put that trust in the higher powers.
Yeah, and we
gaining more knowledge and more experience, right?
Well, that's
something new.
That's a certain level of hubris in the profession that we need to continue to battle against. Hey, we've been doing this for 20 years. We know what works. That's the kind of stuff you hear. We know what works. It's worked for us for 20 years. Okay, I got you, but this works too. And this is the evolution of what you were doing here.
Well, this might work with less stress, right?
Yeah.
Minimal effective dose.
Faster.
Love that.
56 seconds as opposed to 45 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, and even at that point, you can probably, Ryan probably can speak to this. Once an athlete is pretty well versed in the software, right, they can probably just touch the button and set themselves up to go on their own, right? You can have athletes come in and do an assessment. You don't even need to be there to overwatch, right? Once you've gained that trust that they know what they're doing with it, they come in, right? Because they're all on a little bit different schedules. They all usually come in around 8 o'clock or 8 in the morning, but some want to eat breakfast, some don't. Some want to get a therapy session in, some don't. Some want to hit the gym straight away, some don't. Some have other things that they like to do. They just come in and they do it on their own, right? And then
it's voice activated. It's voice activated. It's all it is start and stop. The simplicity of it is insane. Where you can easily have an athlete come in, they press the start button, they verbally say start, they do their squat, they say stop, and the system will move them on to the next movement at 100%. The accessibility of this, it's all voice activated.
Wow, that voice activated. How much easier can you make it? To come in and just to say, okay, I want to do an evaluation today, or I want to assess today, and you're already set up and the coach doesn't have to be there. I think that's a win-win for the athlete, the practitioner or coach or whatever. You might be in the building, but you don't have to be on top of them. And with your very motivated athletes and those especially that are, at a higher training level, they can come in and do it with zero to no instruction once they learn the software.
100%. And again, it's that let's make this so darn easy to use and make it so efficient, because the battle that we've all had as practitioners, coaches, trainers, it's that objectivity to efficiency trade-off. We constantly are battling with it. It's like, I could do the most incredible biomechanical assessment, but it's going to take an hour. Therefore, I just it loses value at that point. I'd rather be training or during that hour. That's why that model or that battle is what has caused people to only do top tier of an assessment, which is really, you're not digging in anything because it's only top tier, but you don't have time to dig into doing the breakouts, these different things. We want to create something that there was no excuse of lack of efficiency, where we could bring objectivity in and actually speed up assessment 1/5. So we even make you more efficient. That and like you mentioned, I mean, it's so simple to use. You can actually have where the athlete is assessing themselves. More data that we have, the more trend data we can look at, the more change over time we can look at, and we can actually, and back to a point you had made. When do we want to try to, adjust biomechanics or not adjust, but enhance biomechanics or alter? The data is suggesting that when their functional movement is at peak and not in a functional fatigue mode, we want to start to incur change there. We can actually be insanely detrimental if we start to try to do a performance change when they're actually in a functional fatigue state.
Right.
So that when do we do what we do? When do we do, implement certain strategies? Trend data tells us when to do that. And
we always get to this point, especially when the conversation is just flying. We're at the last few minutes of the show here, or the last several minutes, and we always like to ask some questions at the end that sound something like, "What's up next for Kinetisense?" or Ryan, what advice do you have for someone wanting to operate in the space that you're in right now, whether they be a trainer or whatever? And then whatever else you want to throw in there that you have going on that we could, put out there.
Yeah, no, I really, really appreciate that. I mean, we're always adding new pieces to the equation. We've released a end user app that's free for the athlete, where you can now send corrective exercises, strategies, send your reports back and forth. That connects to your Kinetisense system. So just trying to drive that communication and engagement and make it very, very simple. So that's something that's new. We're always getting into, again, trying to take that normative data set of different populations and pumping it back in to really add value at the assessment level for the trainer, the coach, the practitioner. So that's really exciting. And then, the thing that I'm probably the most excited about is we're creating different functional movement screens for different sports. So we have our CAMS functional movement screen for the everyday athlete. That is a great, incredible assessment. But we have CAMS Golf that's going to be coming out, which is a movement screen for golf. We're going to have, tennis, football. We're going to be doing the different sports and starting to get a little bit more granular on that level of comparing to more sports specificity or athlete type, which is really cool. So regarding, if I could give any insights into, trainers, coaches, practitioners, anyone that's in the NMSK space, try to look at arming yourself with tools in your toolbox of technologies that do not make you less efficient, that actually make you more efficient, and that add insights to the process of training and onboarding and building that trust relationship with the client. This is the paradigm shift that's happening. There are technologies out there that will really enhance your processes and not inhibit. Start learning about them now. Kinetisense is just one of those tools. We're not the end all be all. We're just one of the tools. So start to look at think different ways that you can drive data on your athlete. Let's think about becoming movement scientists. Because that's really what we're going to see in the next 4 to 5 years. And the individuals that get on this now, the trainers that get on this now, coaches on this now, we're actually going to lead that charge.
Don't be afraid in the beginning. It might feel encumbering to add something new. Don't be afraid of it, right? Embrace it. Embrace the learning process. And eventually there'll be payoff, right? Just like anything else. You put the work in the gym, usually pays off on the field.
9 times out of 10, we ask, specific questions about the profession, but I think we've kind of covered where this part of the profession is going, which is one of the questions. If there was something that you would like to see, start to evolve, keep going or whatever in this profession that is not there yet, just a pet peeve or a project or something that you would like to be part of moving forward, something that's important to you, what would that be?
I think one of the biggest things, and it's getting a lot better, but there's still a lot of room for improvement, is this separation of the clinical world from the sports performance world. They're the same ecosystem. And I guess what I think the future is going to look like, I really do, is that tools that have data like this that live in both spaces, clinically and also on the sports performance side, is actually going to become a communication means for the trainer, the coach, and the practitioner to work together collectively as a team in an ecosystem to enhance that athlete. I honestly think that that's where it's going. We're starting to see this model more and more. We're actually starting to see clinics that have trainers, ATCs, that they're looking at that full performance spectrum. And then also training facilities that have physical therapists and chiropractors and you name it involved. And so we need to realize that we're part of that same continuum and start to really embrace that. We're technically all practitioners, if you think about it. But we have to get everyone up to a similar level. And that's where this expert augmentation comes into play with data.
I think
let's talk the same language. That's the key.
Right. And Chris and I talk a lot about terminology and language and how we're doing that. But also I think there's along with what you're saying, I think it's coming along, but a need for understanding what each does. and understanding that, okay, these are the places where we're connected, but this is what I do as a strength coach. This is what I do as a nutritionist. This is what I do as a DPT. You know, when we all start to, we don't have to have the expert understanding because they're the expert, or whoever that your counterpart is the expert in rehab. But I have to understand the language, and we have to agree that the data that we're looking at are the facts. Your facts aren't different than my facts. So that's
imagine two people from two different countries that speak completely different languages, right?
Right.
I believe the data is actually the translator between the two of them.
Yeah,
I think we have to look at it that way.
Well, I think that's a good point. Listen, this has been great. Chris, you got any final questions?
I don't.
All right. Well, do your thing, buddy.
This has been Performance Talk with Yul Gordon and Chris Costa. Today's guest was Ryan Comeau of Kinetisense. We'll see you guys again real soon.
And